The summer of 1885 carried a dry wind across the plains of Kansas, rattling the shutters of the Whitmore farmhouse and lifting dust through every crack. Clara Whitmore stood on the porch with a small carpetbag at her feet, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. She had not spoken since dawn, not when her mother folded a shawl across her shoulders, not when her father's eyes slid past her, as if she were already gone. It was easier to stay silent than to hear again the words that had driven her from her home. A mistake, they had called it, though no one had cared to hear her side. A shame, they whispered, though it was her family's shame they wished to bury, not hers. The wagon rattled in the yard, the driver already waiting with his hat tipped low to block the Sunday. Clara's brothers stood near the fence, arms crossed, watching her with looks that carried no comfort. It was as if they could not wait for her to be gone, as if the act of her leaving might wash their name clean. Her mother's voice cut sharp through the still air, telling her to go and not look back, to remember that this was for the best. But Clara knew it was not for the best. It was simply easier for them if she disappeared. She lifted her bag, the strap rough against her palm, and forced her feet to move down the steps. Each board creaked like a farewell, like the sound of a door closing forever. The wagon ride into town was long and hot, the sun beating down until her bonnet brim felt heavy against her forehead. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the railroad tracks gleamed like thin silver lines, leading her into exile. No one spoke to her, not the driver, not the few travelers they passed along the road. People had a way of knowing when someone was being sent away in shame, and they turned their eyes aside, as if her disgrace might rub off on them. Clara kept her chin high, though her stomach twisted with each mile. When the train whistled into the station, its steam clouding the air with a hiss like an angry snake, she stepped forward alone. She thought of the man whose name had been given to her, Elias Caro, a rancher somewhere beyond the dry hills of New Mexico. Her mother had said he needed a woman in the house, not a bride of choice but of convenience, and that was good enough for a daughter who no longer had a place under her own roof. Clara pressed her lips together and lifted her carpetbag. The train door yawned open, dark and hollow, and she climbed the steps with a steady hand, though her heart thundered inside her chest. As the wheels clattered against the tracks and the town she had known slipped away behind her, Clara allowed herself one thought she would not share with anyone. If they wanted her gone, if they wanted her hidden in dust and distance, then she would take that exile and shape it into something they could not erase. She looked out at the endless land, the fields giving way to wild stretches of plain, and whispered under her breath a vow only the wind would hear. I will not be their shame. I will not vanish. Whatever waits for me, I will survive it. The train screeched to a halt at the small station on the edge of New Mexico, steam curling into the sharp evening air and drifting across the wooden platform. Clara stepped down with her carpetbag clutched tight in her hand, her boots landing on boards that felt thin and uncertain beneath her weight. The few people waiting glanced her way, then turned aside quickly, their whispers lost beneath the hiss of the engine. She scanned the platform but saw no welcoming smile, no hand raised in greeting, only a tall figure leaning against the post near the end of the platform, hat pulled low, shoulders broad, against the glow of the setting Sunday. He did not move as she approached, and Clara's heart pounded harder with each step. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim, lifted to meet hers for only a second before he straightened. He was a man worn by years of sun and labor, his jaw set in a hard line, his hands rough and scarred from the reins and ropes that filled his days. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost gravel, carrying more weight than warmth. You Clara Whitmore? She nodded, her throat dry. He gave the faintest tilt of his head, then turned without another word. The wagon stood waiting by the road, two tired horses shifting against their harnesses. Clara followed, clutching her bag, the silence between them thick as dust. Elias Caro swung up into the seat, reached once to take her bag from her, then paused, as though the gesture itself cost him more than he cared to give. She settled beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes fixed on the land spreading wide before them. The road wound through miles of barren hills and dry brush, the horizon burning gold as the sun slipped lower. The ride was long, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the sharp cry of a hawk overhead. Elias did not speak, did not ask about her journey, did not offer even the smallest kindness. Yet he did not turn her away. And in his silence, she sensed something heavier than indifference, something carved deep into him. The ranch came into view at last, a stretch of weathered fences, sagging barns, and a house perched on a low rise like a lone sentinel against the open land. It was not grand nor inviting, but it stood with a pride that matched the man beside her. Elias brought the horses to a stop and climbed down, his boots striking the earth with a firm thud. He did not offer a hand as Clara stepped carefully from the wagon, only lifted her bag and set it on the porch. He opened the door, nodded once, and walked inside without looking back. The air inside was cooler, shadows pooling in the corners of the wide kitchen. Clara set her carpet bag near the wall, her breath unsteady. The house smelled faintly of smoke and leather, of meals cooked long ago and a life lived without softness. She stood still, listening to his footsteps fade into another room, then vanish into silence. Alone, she touched the back of a chair worn smooth by use and let her hand rest there, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. This was not a welcome, not a beginning, but it was the place where her exile would root. She drew a breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped further into the stillness, determined that she would not break here. The morning sun poured through the thin curtains of the small room, painting the walls in pale gold that did little to soften the emptiness. Clara rose early, her body aching from the long ride and the weight of unspoken fears. She dressed quickly, smoothed her hair, and stepped into the kitchen, where shadows still lingered. A loaf of bread, hard as stone, sat on the counter beside a tin cup. No note, no greeting, only the faint sound of boots outside in the yard. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and pushed open the back door. The ranch stretched wide under the sky, dust lifting in steady clouds each time the wind shifted. Elias was already at the corral, his figure steady and sure as he checked the horses. He did not glance her way, not even when she lingered at the edge of the porch, hoping for some word of what was expected of her. After a moment, she walked to the pump, a bucket waiting beneath it. She tried the handle, but the iron groaned and stuck, the weight of it biting into her palms. She pressed harder, but nothing came. Only when she turned back did she see Elias watching her from across the yard. His face betrayed nothing, and without a word, he returned to his work. Clara set her jaw and tried again until her arms shook, but the pump refused her. Inside, she searched the cupboards and found little more than flour, beans, and a jar of lard. The stove was cold, the firebox filled with damp wood that hissed instead of burning. She struck match after match, until smoke stung her eyes, and still no flame took hold. At last, when her fingers trembled from frustration, the wood caught with a dull roar. She sank onto the stool, breath ragged, hands blistered from effort. The day stretched long before her, filled with chores she did not know how to name, let alone complete. The wash waited next. Clara hauled the basin to the yard, filled it with water carried in small pails from the well at the far end of the fence. By the time it was half full, her dress clung damp to her back, and her arms shook from strain. She scrubbed each shirt against the board until her knuckles bled, the red mixing with the soap and water. The ranch hands walked past, some nodding politely, others whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "That is the one who cannot bear children," they said. "A barren bride, a shadow in a kitchen." She bit her tongue until the copper taste filled her mouth and bent back over her work, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. By nightfall, the house was silent again. Clara set a small pot of beans on the table, waited, and listened. Elias did not come in. She heard his boots cross the porch once, pause, then retreat. She sat alone in the quiet, hands folded, eyes fixed on the single flame of the lamp. The loneliness pressed in heavy, but in the stillness she found a small spark inside herself, a whisper that said she would not be crushed. If this place demanded her strength, she would give it, not for him, not for them, but to prove that dust and silence could not break her. The days passed slow and heavy, each one much like the last, filled with chores that tested Clara's hands and spirit. She rose before the sun, stoked the reluctant fire, and moved through the silence of the house as if she were a shadow. Elias remained distant, his voice rare. His presence felt more in the creak of boots across the porch than in any words shared. Yet Clara began to notice the smallest things, hints that someone had been near her work even when she thought she stood alone. A loose shutter that rattled in the wind was suddenly fastened tight. A cracked step that caught her hem was replaced with new wood. He never mentioned these things, and she did not thank him, but she carried the knowledge like a secret ember in her chest. On the third evening, after a long day that left her arms raw from scrubbing, Clara baked a small loaf of cornbread. The flour was scarce, and the lard low, but she shaped the dough with careful hands and let it bake until the kitchen filled with a scent that reminded her of gentler years. She did not set it on the table, knowing Elias would not join her, but instead wrapped it in a cloth and carried it to the porch. The sky above was painted in streaks of red and purple, the land falling into shadows as the sun sank behind the hills. She placed the bundle on the rocking chair where he sometimes sat, then went back inside without a word. In the morning, the chair was empty. The cloth had been folded and left neatly on the table by the door. The bread, gone. Clara touched the fabric with the tips of her fingers and felt a warmth bloom in her chest that no fire could have given. That day, when she went to the pump, she found a note tucked beneath the handle. The paper was rough, the letters blocky, written by a hand unused to pen but steady all the same. Turn the valve left, then pump. She followed the instructions, and for the first time water rushed clear and cold into the waiting pail. She stood staring at it, her lips parted, her throat tight with something she could not name. That night, she baked again, not a loaf, but a smaller round, leaving it once more on the chair. The following day, she found the latch on the back gate mended, the splintered wood planed smooth. She touched it as if it were a living thing, her heart whispering what her mouth could not. They were not words, not even gestures seen face to face, but the quiet rhythm of two souls circling each other, each too broken for speech, yet unwilling to let the other fall. When evening came, Clara sat on the porch for the first time, the sky wide and endless above her, and she let the silence rest between them, no longer as heavy stone, but as something gentler, something alive. For the first time since she arrived, she felt not only exile, but the faintest spark of belonging. The barn behind the house had long been left to sag in the sun, its roof patched with tin and its floor scattered with hay and dust. Clara noticed it each morning when she carried water or gathered eggs, and though most saw it as nothing more than a place for spiders and mice, she began to see it differently. She remembered the slate her mother once gave her as a child, the letters traced in chalk, the feeling of holding a word in her hands for the first time. That memory clung to her, even as she scrubbed or cooked, and soon she found herself sweeping out the space near the southern wall where the light fell through a crack in the boards. She gathered scraps of wood and set them upright for stools, found an old chalkboard broken in half and propped it against the wall. At first, she did this only for herself, to fill the silence that pressed too hard. But one morning when she was tracing letters in the dust with a stick, she realized she was not alone. 3 children stood in the doorway, barefoot, their hair tangled and their eyes wary. They belonged to the neighboring farm, and she had seen them now and again, watching from a distance as if unsure what to make of her. The oldest boy held the little one's hand, the girl tucked behind him with suspicion clear on her face. Clara smiled gently and set the stick down. She asked if they wanted to learn a letter, just one. They hesitated, the boy muttering that his pa said she was strange, but curiosity tugged them forward. She handed the smallest child a piece of charcoal and guided her hand in a crooked A across the board. When the little girl laughed at the shape she made, the sound broke the silence in the barn like sunlight spilling through a storm. The next day, they returned with 2 more children from down the road, and soon the barn that had once stood empty began to fill with small voices. She showed them how to hold a pencil, how to spell their names, how to string letters into words that meant something they could keep forever. At times, she sang the alphabet in a soft voice, and the children, shy at first, joined in until the walls echoed with their song. She stitched together pages from a torn ledger and called them books, and the children treated them as treasures. They began calling her Miss Clara, not with reverence, but with the kind of affection that made her eyes sting. The ranch hands still muttered about her, and some townsfolk turned their heads when she passed, but Clara found that it no longer cut so deep. Each day she saw those children run barefoot to the barn. Each day she watched their faces brighten when they shaped words for the first time. And she knew she had found a piece of herself again. In that broken barn, with dust on her skirts and chalk on her fingers, Clara no longer felt like a shadow. She felt like a woman building something that mattered, and that quiet strength carried her through the silence of the nights. The sun stood high and heavy in the sky, its heat pressing down on the land until even the cicadas fell quiet. Clara had taken the children out to the far edge of the pasture, where wild berries grew in clusters along the fence line. Their laughter floated across the grass as they ran from bush to bush, hands stained red with juice, pockets filled with leaves and pebbles they insisted were treasures. Clara knelt near the fence, her skirt brushing the dry earth, her fingers plucking berries while her eyes stayed on the little ones. For a moment she almost felt at peace, as if the cruel whispers of the town and the silence of the house had been left behind. Then, a scream split the quiet. Clara's head snapped up, her breath catching. The smallest boy, Thomas, stood frozen a few paces from the brush, his face pale, his finger pointing. Clara followed his gaze and felt her heart lurch. A rattlesnake, thick and coiled, lay in the grass, its scales glinting like copper, its rattle shaking with a sound that chilled the marrow of her bones. The other children froze too, eyes wide, their small bodies stiff with fear. Clara's first thought was to scream for Elias, but the ranch was too far, and there was no time. The snake drew back, its tongue flicking, its eyes fixed on the boy. Clara's body moved before her mind could stop it. She snatched up a long branch leaning against the fence and stepped between Thomas and the snake, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Her hands trembled, but she held the branch out like a weapon, her voice sharp and commanding as she shouted for the children to move back. They hesitated, too afraid to breathe, until she snapped her voice again, telling them to run to the fence. Slowly, step by step, they obeyed, leaving Thomas behind her. The snake hissed, its body shifting, ready to strike. Clara tightened her grip on the branch, sweat running down her neck, her mouth dry. She forced herself to stand tall, though every part of her longed to flee. Just as the rattling grew louder, a gunshot cracked across the field. The snake jerked, writhed once, and lay still. Clara gasped, the branch lowering from her hands, her knees weak. Elias strode across the pasture, rifle still raised, his face pale with fury and fear. He reached her in long strides, his voice rough as gravel. "You could have been killed." Clara turned to him, her chest heaving, her arms trembling from the rush of it all. "I did what I had to," she said, her voice shaking but firm. His eyes burned into hers, fierce yet softened by something she had not seen before. "Not anyone would have done it," he said, his voice low now, thick with something unspoken. "You are braver than sense allows." Their eyes met, locked in a silence that carried more than words. Clara felt the weight of it settle deep inside her, a recognition she had not expected, as if in that moment he saw her not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as something more. The children clung to the fence, whispering her name, and for the first time since she stepped onto the ranch, Clara felt she was not invisible. She had stood in the dust, faced danger with nothing but her hands, and someone had truly seen her. The night fell quiet across the ranch, the kind of quiet that presses against the skin and makes every sound carry. The cicadas hushed, the wind softened, and the stars opened above like scattered lanterns. Clara sat on the porch, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracing the horizon where the last edge of daylight had faded. The children had long gone home, their voices still echoing in her mind like a hymn, but the stillness now felt heavier, filled with thoughts she could not escape. Inside the house, Elias moved about with his usual silence, boots crossing the floor, a door shutting, then nothing at all. She wondered if he ever truly rested, or if the weight he carried was too great to let him sleep. After a while, she heard the porch boards creak. Elias stepped out, his rifle resting against the wall, his hat in his hand. He lowered himself into the chair beside her, the wood groaning beneath his weight. For a long time he said nothing, only stared into the yard where the grass moved like shadows in the faint light. Clara kept her eyes on her hands, unsure if she should rise or stay. Then his voice came, rough and low, breaking the silence like a stone tossed into still water. "I was married once." Her breath caught, but she did not look up. His hand turned the hat slowly in his lap, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the yard. "Her name was Ruth," he said, softening on the word as if it had once been the sweetest sound. "We had a boy, Samuel. He was only 6 when the fever took him. Ruth tried to nurse him through the night, but she caught it too. I buried them both before the frost came." His voice cracked at the end, a sound that scraped against Clara's chest. She lifted her eyes and saw his face in the pale starlight, worn, shadowed, every line marked with grief that had never left him. She wanted to speak, to offer something, but her throat felt tight. Still, she whispered the truth that had lived inside her since before the exile. "I was promised once." His gaze shifted to her, steady, waiting. "His name was Daniel," she said. "We were set to marry when I turned 18. I fell from a horse in a storm, lost the child before I even knew I was with child. The doctor said I might never bear again. Daniel left the same night. He never even said goodbye." She swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "Since then, no one has looked at me the same." The silence stretched again, but it was no longer empty. It felt like a place where both of them had set their wounds side by side, not hidden, but seen. Elias leaned back in his chair, his voice low, almost tender. "You carry it like a stone," he said, "but you're still standing. That counts for more than most." Clara drew in a long breath, the cool air filling her chest, and for the first time since she arrived, she felt less alone. "The stars did not shout to be seen," Elias added after a moment. "They just burned quiet and steady." She turned her gaze skyward, her lips trembling with something close to hope. In that hush beneath the night, neither of them spoke again, but both knew something had shifted, small as an ember yet strong enough to glow. The county fair came with the chill of autumn in the air, banners strung between wooden posts, and the smell of cider drifting through the square. Clara walked beside Elias, her plain dress brushed clean, her hair tied back in a single braid. She felt the weight of eyes on her before they even reached the market, whispers slipping behind fans and over shoulders like snakes in the grass. She kept her chin steady, though her palms were damp, though her stomach twisted with the familiar ache of being judged. Elias walked tall at her side, but his silence did little to shield her from the murmurs. She heard them as clear as bells. That is her, the barren one. Poor Elias, marrying a dry field. She lost a child and never bore again. Clara's face burned, her hands curling at her sides. She wanted to vanish into the dust, but the children she had taught clung to her skirt, their voices tugging her back to herself. "Miss Clara," one whispered, "will we read today?" She looked down at their bright eyes and managed a small smile. "Only if you remember every word," she told them, her voice firm enough to make their shoulders straighten. Elias stopped suddenly, his jaw clenched as he stared at a group of men lounging by the saloon. They laughed, one of them spitting into the dirt, their sneers loud enough for Clara to know what was meant for her. He dropped her hand, his fists tight, his eyes sharp as if ready for a fight. Clara touched his arm quickly, her voice low but steady. "Not like this," she whispered. "They want a show, but we will give them something else." She stepped forward, her heart pounding, and clapped her hands loud enough to draw the crowd's attention. "Children," she called, "it is time." From behind barrels and stalls, the little ones she had been teaching appeared, their cheeks flushed, their hands clutching worn scraps of paper. They gathered in the center of the square, barefoot and nervous, until Clara knelt to smooth a collar, brush a smudge from a cheek, and nod with encouragement. Then she stepped aside. Their voices trembled at first, small and uncertain. But as the words of the poem filled the air, they grew stronger. "We are the ones you left behind," they began. "In fields of sweat, in sun that blinds, but words we learn and hope we grow from roots of women you don't know." Clara's throat tightened as she listened, her eyes stinging as the crowd fell silent. "She taught us not to fear the dark, to write our names, to leave a mark. Though barren they say her womb may be, her heart gave life to kids like me." By the final line, the market was hushed, even the gossipers with pies in their hands staring wide-eyed. Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low, pride burning in his eyes. Clara lifted her chin, standing tall among the children who clutched her hands. Her voice now carried, not by whispers of shame, but by proof of what she had built. For the first time since her exile began, she was not a burden to hide, but a woman others looked to with awe. The air was cool with the first breath of winter, the sky pale as Elias led Clara beyond the edge of the ranch. He had said little that morning, only saddled the horses and told her to ride with him a while. She followed without question, her skirts brushing the sides of the mare, her hands tight on the reins as the land stretched wide and silent around them. They passed the wheat fields, now stubbled and dry, the fences leaning under the weight of time, until the path gave way to stone and scrub. Clara wondered where he was leading her, though something in his set jaw and steady gaze kept her from asking. At last he slowed near a shallow bluff, dismounting with movements that seemed heavier than usual. Clara slid from her saddle and tied her horse beside his, her eyes narrowing as she saw what stood a few paces ahead. A small wooden cross leaned in the earth, weathered and crooked, a strip of ribbon tied around it, its color faded to the ghost of pink. Her breath caught, the stillness of the place pressing into her chest. Elias stood beside it, his hat held in both hands, his eyes low. "This is where I come when the house grows too quiet," he said at last, his voice low and raw. "My wife and boy never made it home. Wagon overturned in the valley. There was nothing left to bury. The preacher gave me a plot in town, but it felt wrong to place empty earth under stone. So I made this instead." Clara's throat tightened, her eyes fixed on the ribbon that stirred faintly in the wind. "I used to talk to them here," he went on, "about the cattle, the rain, the little things. But after you came, I stopped." Clara looked up sharply, surprised. "Why?" she whispered. He drew a long breath, his jaw working, "Because for the first time in years, I did not feel alone." His words hung in the air, heavy yet tender, and Clara's chest ached with the weight of them. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver ring, simple and worn, the faint design of vines etched along its edge. "This belonged to my mother," he said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled faintly. "She gave it to my wife. When we Wednesday, I told myself I would never give it again." He turned to Clara, his eyes clear though shadowed with sorrow. "I am not asking for children or promises the world says matter. I am telling you I choose you, not because I am lonely, not because I need someone to cook or clean, but because you brought life back to this place." Clara felt the sting of tears but did not let them fall. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she took the ring from his palm and closed it in her fingers. She looked up at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You did not have to say all that." He smiled faintly, the lines of grief softening. "I wanted to." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining, callous meeting callous, two lives worn but steady. They stood together in the fading light, the cross casting a long shadow across the ground. Clara pressed the ring against her chest, her heart steady for the first time in years. She had been sent here in shame, but now, standing beside Elias, she knew she had been chosen not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as a woman worth loving. The night was still when the first blaze rose, a glow at the edge of the ranch that grew into a roar before anyone stirred. Clara woke to the smell of smoke, sharp and choking, and the sound of shouting outside. She stumbled from her bed, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, and ran to the porch. The barn was aflame, the fire leaping high into the black sky, sparks flying like a storm of angry stars. Men were already running with buckets, their voices hoarse with panic, the horses screaming inside the stables. Garrett's voice cut through the chaos, shouting orders, his rifle slung across his back as he dragged open the corral gate to free the terrified animals. Clara's heart pounded as she saw two of the children who had come for lessons earlier that day, their faces pale in the glow, trapped near the barn's side door. Without thought, she gathered her skirts and ran toward them. The heat struck her like a wall, her lungs burning with each breath, but she pushed forward, calling their names. The children clung to each other, too frightened to move, and she pulled them into her arms, urging them toward the back exit. A beam cracked above her, falling in a shower of sparks that nearly struck her head. She shielded the children with her own body, forcing them through the smoke toward the gap in the wall, where men waited to pull them out. She shoved them forward, her eyes stinging, her throat raw, and for one moment she thought she might follow. Then the loft gave way with a deafening crash, the flames swallowing the space around her. Garrett roared her name, his voice breaking through the din. He fought against the men holding him back, his face wild with fear, his boots digging furrows in the dirt as he tried to charge into the fire. "Let me through," he bellowed. "She's in there." The men dragged him down, shouting that he would burn alive. But Garrett's fury was a force they could barely hold. Then, above the roar, a faint cry reached him, so soft he thought it must be a trick of his mind. "Help!" He tore free and plunged through the smoke, his sleeve catching sparks, his chest heaving. Inside, he found her pinned under a beam, her dress blackened, her hair tangled with ash, her body still trembling with life. With a strength born of terror, he heaved the wood aside and gathered her into his arms, cradling her against him. "I've got you," he whispered, his tears cutting streaks in the soot on his face. "I've got you, Clara." He carried her out into the cool night, the crowd parting, the fire still raging behind them. He dropped to his knees in the grass, holding her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "You foolish, brave woman," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You could have died." She stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open, her lips trembling with the smallest smile. "You said you needed me," she whispered. "Just me." He clutched her tighter, his tears falling freely now. "Just you," he vowed. "Always just you." Around them, the barn burned to its bones, but in his arms, life was renewed, fierce and unshakable, a love that no flame could consume. Spring came soft to the valley, the rains gentle and steady, the air carrying the scent of wet earth and wildflowers pushing through the dust. The blackened ruins of the barn had long been cleared away, and in its place a new one rose, simpler than the first, but built by hand with sweat and quiet purpose. Garrett worked alongside the ranch hands, his shoulders strong beneath the weight of beams, his palms blistered from hammer and rope. But there was a new steadiness in him, a life that had returned after years of silence. Clara was always near, her skirts tucked at the waist, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled as she lifted, carried, and built with him. Each evening they stood side by side, watching the sun sink behind the mesas, no words needed between them, because their bond was now carved into every nail and board. It was on one of those mornings, when the dew still clung to the grass, that Garrett found the boy. He was no more than 4 years old, huddled near the border fence with dust in his mouth and a ragged toy horse clutched to his chest. His eyes were wide, frightened and silent, no name spoken, no sound at all. Garrett lifted him gently, cradled him against his chest, and carried him back to the house. Clara met him on the porch, her breath catching as the child's small fingers clung to her dress. She gathered him into her arms without hesitation, her heart already claimed by the boy who looked at her with desperate trust. Garrett's voice was steady as he said, "He is ours." They named him Levi. At first he did not speak, trailing Clara like a shadow, helping her water the herbs in the garden, watching as she read aloud to the chickens as though they too needed lessons. Slowly, the silence broke. One evening he laughed when Garrett hoisted him onto a horse. Another morning he spoke his first clear word, "Mama," as he tugged Clara's skirt. Garrett stepped out to the porch then, his eyes stinging with pride, his chest so full he could barely draw breath. The ranch no longer felt like exile. It felt like a home. In town, the whispers that once cut like blades softened. Women approached Clara at the market, thanking her for teaching their children letters, for tending their fevers with herbs, for giving them courage in quiet ways. Men who once muttered behind her back now tipped their hats, their voices carrying respect. Miss Clara had become more than a name. She had become a beacon, not for what she could bear, but for what she had built. Garrett walked beside her with his chin high, pride clear in every step, for the woman once sent to him as shame had become the only one his heart would ever love. That spring they planted a cottonwood tree near the porch. Garrett dug the hole, Clara lowered the sapling, and little Levi carried the pail of water, spilling half on his boots as Clara laughed and Garrett ruffled his hair. The three of them stood together, their hands muddy, their hearts steady, watching as the tree took its first place in the earth. Years from now, its white blooms would rise against the sky, its shade a gathering place, its roots a reminder that love can grow even from dust, that family is not only blood, but the choice to stand together. If you felt the stir of love in this tale of dust and devotion, I invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Out here, every story carries a piece of the wide open sky, and yours matters too. And who knows, maybe next time Levi will manage to carry the whole pail without soaking his boots.